In June of 2022, an odd incident would occur in rural northwestern Montana that would see then 3-year-old Ryker Webb vanish from his home located south of Troy, not far from the Bull Lake area and in close proximity to the Kootenai National Forest. This story really captivated the national press in the States, alongside gripping forums all over the place really, simply as a result of the circumstances, which many people thought were somewhat unusual. The small town of Troy itself is one of those closely knit places, as it only has around 850 residents. While it is considered a mountain state, Ryker lived in Lincoln County, which has a low elevation above the sea level, so it's not particularly high, and the local mountains are just shy of 2,000 feet, though the average across the state is about 3,500 feet. It was a Friday afternoon in this area at around 3 PM when Ryker vanished. He had been in the yard playing with the family dog, and that was the last time he was actually seen before he disappeared. Specifically, his father was the one to see him, as he was outside with him, but after he entered the home to get something and then came back out, Ryker was gone. It's not completely clear why Ryker was left alone, or for how long, though the father, like all of us, would have been experiencing normalcy bias. This is just the idea that usually everything is okay, therefore everything will be okay. Normalcy bias is actually the cause for a lot of our problems, as it puts us in a situation where we can easily get caught by surprise when something actually does happen, since usually nothing actually happens, right up until it does. While obviously it is not advisable to leave a young person outdoors by themselves like this, subconsciously, without even really thinking about it at all, that normalcy bias would have been telling the father, this is a peaceful community, most people know one another, everyone gets on great, it'll be fine. Nothing bad ever happens here. Which, to be fair, really is usually the case, right up until it's not, as demonstrated by this entire incident. So, as Ryker, his father, and the dog were in the yard, Ryker was just searching around the place for bugs and messing around while the dog was following him. He was turning over small rocks to see what he could find, digging a little, and basically just running around and having a good time. At some point though, and it's really not clear what happened, once the father had gone inside, Ryker, in some manner, had left the yard. The dog, however, did not leave, and it was stated that the dog's body language seemed to indicate anxiety. Mr. Webb didn't understand what had even happened right away until he looked around and obviously he couldn't see Ryker anywhere. It was also uncharacteristic of the dog to not be with Ryker, as the two were usually together while out in the yard, so it's not understood why the dog didn't follow him out of the yard. I don't believe that there was any barking to indicate some kind of struggle, and clearly nobody could have heard anything to that end, or I'd imagine that the father would have come sprinting out as soon as it happened. Within the area that the Webbs lived, there are known populations of predatory animals, such as mountain lions and bears, but you'd think that if one of the two had gotten to Ryker, then the dog would likely have made a big scene about that. In fact, given the nature of dogs, regardless of what actually happened, I can see why there are those that found this fact to be odd and of interest. Although there is the possibility that the dog had some training not to leave the premises, but usually they are quite protective. In any case, as for the father, once he realised that Ryker wasn't present, he panicked and began to dash around calling out Ryker's name, but he was quite literally nowhere to be seen. All we know is that the father came back outside after several minutes of separation, and whatever happened must have happened fast. Whether Ryker left of his own accord or if something else transpired, he was no longer in the immediate vicinity, and had seemingly travelled far away enough to not hear the calls for him. After darting about the place unsuccessfully, other family members were also now involved in the search, and this is where a crucial mistake was made. There was a rather large delay of 2 hours before actually taking the time to report Ryker missing. I can understand and sympathise with the fact that there would have been a lot of panic, and the family may not even have realised how much time had passed in their frantic state. Sources also vary here. Some state that it wasn't even the family who reported him missing, but instead neighbours, likely at the behest of the family, whereas others state that it was the family themselves who called in the report. I'd have to imagine it was the family though. What a bizarre decision that would have to have been to have someone else do it, right? I'm inclined to think that there may have been a mistake or a miscommunication there with the press. Either way, it was a whole 2 hours of searching before Ryker was finally reported missing, at approximately 4:53 PM. This is important because the duration of a person's last sighting and the beginning of the search operation is paramount, especially in wilderness settings. And of course, this is only amplified when we're talking about those who might be more vulnerable, such as very young people. It really isn't an exaggeration to say that every minute lost in the initial hours significantly diminishes the chances of a successful recovery. A young person can become disoriented quickly and rapidly succumb to environmental threats, whether that takes the form of an animal or really just the elements. And in this instance, the elements were really not so kind or forgiving at all. During the entire duration of this whole ordeal, in a short period of time after Ryker disappeared, the area was facing severe thunderstorms and low temperatures. This, as you might imagine, is among the worst combinations if you were not prepared for it, as low temperatures mixed with rain and strong wind can mean an incredibly quick onset of hypothermia. These conditions also had the double whammy effect of making the search effort very difficult and lowering visibility in the area significantly. In any case, after being reported missing, there was a major search effort that ensued, coordinated by the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, and the turnout for Ryker was nothing short of incredible. It rapidly escalated into a vast network of resources, volunteers, and personnel from various states and many agencies that are just too numerous to list. But aside from all the people on the ground, including search dog teams on off-road vehicles, there were helicopters with infrared equipment, and many drones too. The first 50 people to enter the forest area were police officers alongside volunteers in the immediate vicinity, and they got to work. They were hoping to find anything that might insinuate a direction of travel. Little footprints, a shoe, a dropped toy, but sadly there was none of these indicators anywhere. This was all organised within just a couple of hours of Ryker disappearing, and then the dogs were brought in and they didn't find a scent anywhere. This went on for around 3 hours, but then, as stated, the search was severely hampered by the poor weather conditions that immediately got worse right as the search began to find its rhythm. By the evening, the severe thunderstorms, heavy rain and low visibility forced the helicopters and drones down to the ground. Those that were inside the forest were put into a fairly bad situation themselves and their efforts slowed to a crawl. The conditions were so bad that if one wasn't careful enough, a searcher could also have become injured or lost, and the entire situation would have just become so much worse. I also get the sense, actually, reading through the reports, that it had gotten so cold so quickly and the winds and rain were so bad that it really just wasn't looking great, and it just seems as though people were expecting the worst outcome, even if they were trying to remain hopeful. Thankfully, on the second day, the weather had let up, though the search parties were worried about running into bears or mountain lions, so they had to stay fairly close to one another. But even so, it was on that day that they'd found their first somewhat strange clue, but it was at least something. It was reported that on a trail behind the family home a ways, searchers found some rocks that had been freshly overturned. Ryker had literally been doing this in the yard, so they now believed that they had a vague direction of travel. They obviously had no idea where he'd gone from there because there were no further tracks. The searchers had been hopeful to find some of his little footprints somewhere, but it just wasn't happening. But it was at least a start, and it was south from the home, so searchers began to branch out from there. It's important to highlight just how time was of the essence here. The searchers weren't just battling the fear of dehydration or animals, but really, perhaps even more pressing than any of those things, was the fear of hypothermia. Ryker was obviously not dressed to withstand the weather and temperature that he found himself in. For all intents and purposes, this should have been a guaranteed case of hypothermia, since temperatures were close to freezing, coupled with the heavy downpours and wind. Only this didn't happen. On the 5th of June that year, after enduring 2 harrowing days alone in the wilderness, Ryker was found safe. His discovery was made by a family who'd heard of Ryker's disappearance on social media, and they happened to live in an area nearby. So they decided to check their property, and it was only when they arrived at their remote cabin did they hear a faint voice. This voice belonged to Ryker, and it was coming from the shed right behind the cabin. Ryker had managed to travel around 2.5 miles to this place, or about 4 kilometers from his starting location back at home. Despite being somewhat cold, he was found in surprisingly good health, though the ordeal had taken its toll on him. He was said to be very scared and had a wide-eyed look to him, which I think is completely understandable. That can't have been a particularly pleasant experience for him. To that end, actually, you can only really hope that because it happened to him so young, he might just be able to forget that somewhat as he grows up, and those uncomfortable thoughts might not linger, although that might be wishful thinking. Even if you don't have a vivid memory of an uncomfortable event like this, certain emotional problems can still persist. The good news was that aside from some bruising and scratching, he was completely fine. Although that, in and of itself, caused certain questions to emerge. People wanted to know how such a small young person, wearing only a onesie, could have survived this ordeal without suffering from hypothermia. I've covered this exact scenario a few times across the channel, where a young person will vanish in a wilderness area with treacherous terrain and terrible freezing weather conditions, only to be found in good condition. In some of these instances, the searchers also expressed their confusion. There have been similar disappearances to this, where people did begin to suspect that at first the young person may have been taken by a third party. This said third party, presumably, must have kept them warm and safe, but then realised that the heat from law enforcement was very high. They must have realised that the searches were absolutely enormous, and because of that, abandoned the young person in the forest. I don't imagine that to be the case here though, because while Ryker couldn't recount the entire time he spent missing exactly, his account suggested that he simply went out for a long walk, alone. You'd imagine that if Ryker was literally taken by another person, he would have said something about that when he was later asked what happened. While that didn't happen precisely, he did say something particularly odd a few weeks after he was found. He'd said to his brother that during his time spent missing, he came across a house in the woods and that there was someone inside. That is fairly strange. I don't believe that during the search anyone came across this supposed house, so I'm not sure what he was referring to. Because he was only 3 years old, it's difficult to know what to do with that information, but he never said that he interacted with this supposed person or was taken by them. It's weird, but what do you do with that? Suggesting that he may have hallucinated feels a little dismissive saying it out loud, so I'm not really sure. It was never brought up again. One way or another, law enforcement didn't actually close the case right away. Instead, I think they were interested in some of these lingering questions too, in regards to how exactly Ryker managed to survive this ordeal. In addition to that, I think they also wanted to know more about why Ryker was left alone, for how long, and why it took 2 hours to be called in. You can certainly see why these questions were somewhat pressing to the authorities. I suppose that they were looking for signs of neglect really, though I don't believe that they found anything to suggest that this was anything more than an accident. Representatives from the sheriff's office at the time did publicly state that they held the parents responsible, though despite that no formal charges were ever filed against them. After being found, Ryker was placed in the back of an ambulance and assessed by Bull Lake volunteer paramedics, which is where this now famous photograph was taken. His eyes appear unusually wide, which obviously hint at the kind of distress he'd been placed under, and is suggestive of someone who had endured a profoundly unsettling experience. I'm sure that you can imagine, but the owners of the cabin who discovered Ryker were equally astonished by the circumstances. Initially, they were perplexed as to how a 3-year-old could even have gained entry in the first place, and they found Ryker just huddling in the corner of the shed for warmth. This decision by Ryker, however he actually managed to get in, is quite literally responsible for his survival. If he hadn't have come across the shed by sheer luck, I assume, in the middle of nowhere, it is universally agreed upon that hypothermia would have claimed him. When asked about this, all Ryker stated was that he went for a long walk by himself and then got tired. I mean, he was 3 years old, he wouldn't have had a clue what was going on. It's not clear if he was in the shed for both nights or just one of them. As said, the shed was 2.5 miles away. You have to imagine that it must have taken him a little while to get there, especially while totally aimless as well. Because people wanted an explanation as to precisely what had happened here, since there were quite a few people that found this entire ordeal highly suspicious, the sheriff's office tried to reconstruct what had happened. They said that they believed that he'd gotten bored looking for bugs in the garden, and just wasn't having much success, and so he wandered over to the neighbouring trees bordering the forest to look for some more. There, he just kept finding rocks and got carried away with himself and continued deeper into the forest until he was thoroughly lost and not realising from which direction he entered. They also stated that when the storm hit, that it might have prompted Ryker to look for shelter. And then they just kind of glazed over and gave short shrift to the fact that he would have had to have walked 2.5 miles to find this shed. And it's not like it's flat terrain either, this would have been very hilly and forested. In addition to that, they also didn't have much of an explanation as to why the dog did not follow Ryker out. I suppose that they must have been insinuating that Ryker found the shed on the first night of his disappearance. Which I suppose you kind of have to reason it that way, otherwise the likelihood would have been that Ryker wouldn't be here with us today if he hadn't have found somewhere to shelter from the elements. One cited issue was the fact that when Ryker was found, he was showing signs of fear, obviously, but he didn't exhibit any signs of severe dehydration. Given that a fully grown man can last for 3 days or so without water, and especially with very young people, we know that they are more susceptible to dehydration. I can see why people had questions about that. People began to wonder whether or not he might have received sustenance during the time he spent missing. What this might have looked like though is anyone's guess. Did Ryker himself find some water that he could have drank, or could someone have given him some? There was no direct evidence that supported Ryker being taken by a third party. Though I'm sure that there are those that look at the fact that he was in the shed as though he might have been dropped off there by someone. The general speculation, as far as I can tell, is that when Ryker's father entered the home, someone may have already been watching the yard and found their moment to strike, so to speak. As I mentioned earlier, one could envisage a situation in which this supposed perpetrator acted and then got cold feet about the whole ordeal and dropped him off at the shed 2.5 miles away. It might not even have been cold feet as such, but once the person realised just how much heat had been generated by their actions and the scale of the search that ensued, I could imagine a person believing that they were going to get caught, and therefore reverse their decision. I do want to clarify that this talking point is highly speculative, and I would just reiterate that there was no direct evidence present that suggested that this happened. The slight bruising and scratches to Ryker was consistent with roaming around aimlessly in the wilderness, taking a few tumbles and getting caught by the bushes. What perhaps isn't consistent with that, as has been pointed out by some, is the distance travelled in the stormy conditions that he would have found himself in. Alongside appearing as though he may have had some water, although I suppose he could have drank from a puddle or something. I must say though, it seems to me in this instance that if a third party had taken Ryker from the garden, the dog would likely have gone absolutely nuts. I'd imagine just outright chasing the perpetrator, but at least a lot of barking, which again was never heard. Perhaps that in and of itself just indicates that Ryker somehow just got out of the yard and walked away calmly. While researching this case, I actually came across another strikingly similar and recent disappearance actually, that some people felt was very strange. That is Phoenix Wilkerson, who was 4 years old when he disappeared in Alabama last year. Phoenix is a non-verbal autistic boy, which is worth highlighting not only because it tends to require a highly specialised search, but I've also covered a number of young people like this, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. In any case, his family were out in a camper at the time in Barber County on the 12th of January at about 12:30 PM. His mother realised that the door to the camper was just open and she couldn't find Phoenix anywhere. She quickly reported what had happened to the authorities, who immediately felt that something was off. You had a situation in which a young boy disappeared without a trace from what should have been a secure environment, and nobody had seen it happen. Thankfully, Phoenix was found, but only after being missing for around 50 hours. The problem was that the way he was found wasn't very consistent to my understanding of being out in this rugged wilderness area for that long. For instance, the temperatures had dropped to around 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about -3 degrees Celsius. Phoenix was scared upon his discovery, but ultimately he was in very good condition. He hadn't suffered from hypothermia, and despite being barefoot, his feet were described as surprisingly clean despite being found in rugged, wooded terrain. This clean state, alongside the fact that it appeared as though he'd been kept warm somehow, struck many as odd, and I can certainly see why. It harkens back to the talking point from a moment ago, where you have to question whether or not someone may have taken him and then had cold feet. Again, there's no evidence of that as far as I'm aware, but he was certainly found with some odd qualities in some sense. He was also found around 150 yards away from a field where searchers had previously spotted some small footprints that they suspected belonged to Phoenix. But he didn't appear to be in the area initially. Just to highlight that point, when they found the footprints, initially they flooded the area with professional searchers, volunteers, drones, helicopters and dogs. Somehow that search effort failed, and he was found the following day quite literally in the same spot. Many found that fairly difficult to explain, without suggesting that there may have been some third-party involvement, whatever form that may have taken. If people would like to know more about that entire situation, I could make a full video on it. Anyway, I've seen other people compare Ryker's disappearance to Casey Hathaway, and I can certainly understand why people might do that. The major difference that I can see really is that Casey literally said that he'd been looked after by a bear in the woods for 3 days, while Ryker said that he was alone. Although Ryker did mention finding the house in the woods with a person inside. For those people that have never heard of Casey and don't know what I'm talking about, I'll leave a link in the description to my coverage of Casey's disappearance. Ultimately though, I think you can say that Ryker's disappearance was somewhat odd, and warranted the kind of suspicions that it drew in. In the end, you still have a situation in which a young boy survived in conditions that were highly likely to have ended much differently. He still travelled 2.5 miles from his home, supposedly unaided through very rugged terrain, and of course there was the issue with the delayed missing persons report, but that seems like you can put that down to a panicked family who were desperately trying to search, as bad of a decision as that may have been. In the end, I'm just glad that this had a positive outcome and that Ryker was found safely. At the very least, it serves as a good warning to everyone really to not be so complacent and to understand our normalcy bias, because really, that's the only way to avoid the pitfalls that come along with it. With that, that brings us to the end of this. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found this video interesting, please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to leave me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.